The phone rang at 2:47 in the morning. Mark stared at the unknown number, his thumb hovering over the decline button. Snow swirled against the window of his one-bedroom apartment. His 6-year-old daughter slept in the next room, clutching a worn, stuffed bunny. The phone kept ringing. He answered. A woman's voice came through, trembling and barely above a whisper. "Mark, it's Sarah. Sarah from Oak Creek High. Can you come get me?" He locked the door. "I'm outside and it's freezing and I don't have anywhere to go." He looked at his sleeping daughter, then at the blizzard outside. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you're new here, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. 3 hours earlier, Mark had come home from a 10-hour shift fixing engines at a grim auto repair shop. His hands still smelled like grease and oil. The apartment was dark, except for the television's blue glow, where his daughter, Lily, had fallen asleep on the couch. Her small body curled around a bunny so old its fabric had worn thin in patches. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her breathe. She was 6 years old, and she was everything he had. Mark lifted her gently, careful not to wake her, and carried her to the bedroom. The apartment was small enough that 5 steps took him from the living room to her bed. He tucked the quilt around her shoulders and placed the bunny under her arm. She stirred slightly, murmuring something he couldn't understand, then settled back into sleep. He closed her door halfway and returned to the living room. Dirty dishes sat in the sink. A stack of bills covered one corner of the kitchen table, some of them marked with red letters he tried not to look at. Laundry spilled from a basket by the couch, waiting to be folded. Mark sat down heavily and pulled out his wallet. $42 until Friday. He did the math in his head, the same calculation he'd done 1,000 times. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Lily needed new boots because her toes were pushing against the front of her old ones. The heating bill was already a month behind. He leaned back and let his eyes close. On the wall across from him hung a drawing Lily had made in marker. 2 stick figures holding hands inside a small house. Just 2 figures. No one else. That was when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. His first instinct was to ignore it. Nothing good ever came from unknown calls in the middle of the night. But something made him answer anyway. The voice on the other end sent him 15 years into the past. Sarah. He hadn't heard that voice since high school, since a night after graduation when they'd sat on the hood of his car and talked until the sun came up. She'd been wearing a leather pendant he'd bought her with 3 weeks of grocery bagging money. They'd almost kissed that night, almost became something more. But life had other plans. She moved away that summer. He stayed. They lost touch the way young people do. Slowly and then all at once. Now her voice came through the phone, stripped of everything he remembered. No laughter, no warmth, just fear. "Can you come get me?" He locked the door. Mark was already reaching for his keys. "Where are you?" She gave him an address on the other side of the city. He wrote it on the back of an envelope, his handwriting barely legible. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Stay somewhere warm if you can." He hung up and stood in the middle of his apartment, caught between 2 impossible choices. He couldn't leave Lily alone, but he couldn't leave Sarah out there either. Mrs. Higgins. The thought came to him like a lifeline. His neighbor across the hall, a retired woman who'd watched Lily a dozen times before when his shifts ran late. He knocked on her door, apologizing for the hour, explaining only that there was an emergency. She asked no questions, just pulled on her shawl and shuffled across to his apartment. Mark drove through streets that were empty, except for the snow. His wipers could barely keep up with the flurry. At red lights, he caught himself gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles ached. He found her at a bus shelter near her address, huddled under the plexiglass that did almost nothing to block the biting wind. She was freezing, wearing only a thin cardigan and jeans. When his headlight swept across her, he saw the bruise on her cheekbone, dark and swollen. She got into his car without a word. Melting snow dripped from her hair onto the seats. Her hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. Mark pulled off his heavy coat and handed it to her. She wrapped it around her shoulders like armor. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the wind on the roof and the rhythm of the wipers. Then Sarah reached out and touched something hanging from his rear-view mirror, a thin leather pendant tarnished with age. "You still have it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It reminds me of simpler times." She let go of the pendant and turned to look out the window. "I'm sorry, Mark. I didn't know who else to call. My family's gone. My friends, he made sure I lost them all. Your number was the only one I still remembered by heart." He didn't ask who he was. The bruise on her face told him enough. They pulled up to his apartment building. The snow had softened to a steady drift. Mark cut the engine but didn't move to get out. "It's small," he said, staring at the building's front door. "Really small, and I've got a kid, so it's not quiet, but there's still room if you need it." Sarah shook her head slowly. "I can't do that to you. You have your own life, your own problems." "Sarah, it's almost 3 in the morning. You're bleeding. We'll figure the rest out tomorrow." She looked at him, then really looked, and something in her expression cracked open. She nodded once and followed him inside. The apartment was dark when they entered. Mrs. Higgins had dozed off in the armchair, and she woke with a start when the door opened. Mark thanked her quietly, promised to explain later, and walked her back across the hall. When he returned, Sarah was standing in the middle of his living room, dripping onto the worn carpet. She looked lost, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to exist in this space. A small voice came from the hallway. "Daddy." Lily stood in her bedroom doorway, clutching Mr. Hops against her chest. Her eyes were wide and fixed on the strange woman in their home. Mark walked over and crouched down to her level. "Hey, baby, why are you awake?" "I heard voices." Lily's gaze didn't leave Sarah. "Who is she?" "She's a friend. She needs help." He smoothed a hand over Lily's messy hair. "Remember what we talked about? When someone needs help and we can help, what do we do?" Lily thought about it, her small face serious. "We help." "That's my girl." Lily studied Sarah for another long moment. Then she walked over, her bare feet patting softly on the carpet, and held out her stuffed bunny. "You can borrow Mr. Hops. He helps me when I'm sad." Sarah dropped to her knees so she was at eye level with the child. Her hands trembled as she accepted the worn bunny. Tears spilled down her cheeks, mixing with the melted snow that still clung to her skin. "Thank you, sweetheart," she managed. "Thank you so much." Lily nodded with the gravity of someone who understood that some things were too important for words. Then she looked up at her father. "She can stay, Daddy. There's room." Mark felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that he'd kept locked for a long time. He looked at his daughter, then at Sarah, then at the tiny apartment that could barely contain 2 people, let alone 3. But Lily was right. There was room. The first 3 days were an exercise in careful navigation. Mark gave up his bed and moved to the couch, insisting that Sarah take the bedroom with Lily. The apartment had never felt so small. Every morning, 3 people rotated through one bathroom. Every evening, 3 plates crowded onto a table built for 2. Sarah flinched at sudden noises. The first time Mark dropped his wrench on the counter, she jerked backward so violently she knocked over a glass of water. She apologized over and over while cleaning it up, her hands shaking against the paper towels. Mark pretended not to notice. He knew that acknowledging it would only make it worse. Lily watched everything with eyes that missed nothing. She didn't ask questions about why Sarah jumped at loud sounds, or why she sometimes stared at the locked front door like she expected it to burst open. But Mark saw the way his daughter observed, processing information she was too young to fully understand. On the third evening, Mark came home from work to find Lily at the kitchen table with her markers. She was drawing with intense concentration, her tongue poking out slightly from the corner of her mouth, the way it always did when she was focused. He looked over her shoulder at the picture. 3 stick figures inside a house shape. But the third figure, the one with long hair like Sarah, stood outside a window looking in. "That's a nice picture, baby," Mark said carefully. "Can you tell me about it?" Lily shrugged without looking up. "It's our house." "I see that. But why is she outside?" His daughter finally met his eyes. "I don't know if she's staying." The words hit Mark somewhere deep. He understood then that Lily was protecting herself, building walls around her heart before they could be broken again. Her mother had left when she was 2 years old. One morning she was there and the next she was gone, leaving behind only a worn bunny and a silence that Mark had never fully explained. Now his daughter was bracing for another departure. That night after Lily was asleep, Mark sat alone in the kitchen staring at the bills that never seemed to shrink. Rent was still due in 11 days. His $42 had become $27 after gas to get to work. Adding another person to the household meant more food, more electricity, more water. Numbers that didn't add up, no matter how many times he calculated them. Sarah appeared in the doorway. She'd showered and changed into clothes they'd bought at a thrift store, since she'd left her home with nothing but what she was wearing. Her bruise had faded to yellow at the edges, but it was still visible in the dim light. "You should be sleeping," he said. "Can't." She sat down across from him. "I saw Lily's drawing." Mark didn't respond. "I'm making things harder for you," Sarah continued. "I can see it in those bills. I can see it in how tired you look. I was tired before you got here. Mark, don't pretend this isn't a burden." He set down the bill he'd been holding. "What do you want me to say? That this is easy? It's not. But that doesn't mean I regret it." Sarah looked down at her hands. "I need to do something. I can't just sit here and think all day. Let me help around the house at least. Cooking, cleaning, whatever. I need to be useful." Mark thought about arguing, about telling her she didn't owe him anything. But he recognized the desperation in her voice. It wasn't about repaying a debt. It was about feeling like she still existed, like she still had purpose. "Okay," he said, "but only if you want to." The next morning, Mark woke to the smell of eggs and toast. Sarah was in the kitchen moving with a quiet efficiency that suggested she'd been up for hours. Lily sat at the table watching her with the same careful observation she'd been practicing all week. "Miss Sarah makes eggs different than you, Daddy," Lily announced when Mark emerged from the couch. "Better or worse?" His daughter considered the question with great seriousness. "Different." Mark caught Sarah's eye across the kitchen. For the first time since that snowy night, she almost smiled. The days began to develop a rhythm. Mark went to work. Sarah cleaned the apartment until it gleamed, then started on small repairs he'd been putting off for months. A squeaky cabinet hinge, a bathroom faucet that dripped. Tasks she said she'd learned from watching videos during long hours alone in her old house. Lily remained cautious, but her walls were developing cracks. On the 5th day, Sarah found her drawing at the kitchen table and asked if she could sit down. "You're really good at this," Sarah said, studying the marker landscape Lily was creating. "Can you teach me?" Lily's eyebrows rose. It was clear that adults didn't usually ask children to teach them things. She handed Sarah a blue marker with the gravity of a surgeon passing a scalpel. "You have to stay inside the lines," Lily instructed, "but not too much. A little bit outside is okay because it makes it look more real." They drew together in silence for a while. Then Lily spoke without looking up from her paper. "Miss Sarah, do you have a mommy?" Sarah's hand stilled over her drawing. "I did. She passed away a few years ago." "My mommy went away too." Lily pressed harder with her yellow marker, filling in a sun. "But she didn't die. She just left." The air in the room felt heavier. Sarah searched for the right words and found none. Lily kept coloring. "Are you going to leave too?" Sarah set down her marker and turned to face the little girl. "I don't want to, but sometimes grown-ups have to do things they don't want to. That's what Daddy says about work." "Your daddy is a smart man." Lily finally looked up. "If you stay, you can keep borrowing Mr. Hops, but only if you stay." That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Mark and Sarah sat on the couch while snow tapped against the windows. A gentler snow than the storm that had brought her here, but snow nonetheless. "She asked if I was going to leave," Sarah said quietly. Mark nodded. "She asks me that about everybody, the mailman, her teacher, Mrs. Higgins across the hall." "What do you tell her?" "The truth, that some people stay and some people go, and we can't always control which is which." Sarah turned to look at the leather pendant still hanging from his keys on the hook by the door. "I should have chosen you, Mark. Back then, after graduation, I was stupid to let us drift apart. We were kids. We didn't know anything. You knew enough to be kind." Her voice cracked slightly. "I forgot what that felt like until now." They sat in the darkness, not touching but closer than they'd been in 15 years. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of a road not taken that might finally have a second chance. On the 8th day, Mark came home from work to find an unfamiliar car parked in front of his building. He noticed it immediately because he noticed everything about his surroundings now. A week of being on edge had sharpened his senses. He scanned the street, the sidewalk, the windows of his building. Nothing seemed out of place. But as he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, he heard shouting. A man's voice, loud and angry, echoing through the hallway. "Sarah, I know you're in there. Open the damn door." Mark took the remaining stairs 2 at a time. When he rounded the corner, he saw a man in an expensive wool coat pounding on his apartment door. Broad shoulders, hands that looked like they knew how to hurt. Richard. It had to be. "Hey." Mark kept his voice steady as he approached. "You need to leave." Richard spun around. His face was red with rage, but there was something calculated in his eyes that told Mark this man was dangerous in more ways than one. "Who the hell are you?" Richard demanded. "This is between me and my wife." "Not anymore. She's not going anywhere with you." Richard stepped closer, close enough that Mark could smell alcohol on his breath. "You think you can take what's mine?" "She's not yours." Mark didn't back away. "She's not anybody's property. Now leave before I call the cops." Richard shoved him hard in the chest. Mark stumbled backward, but kept his footing. Every instinct screamed at him to fight back, to make this man understand with his fists what words couldn't convey. But he thought of Lily. He thought of the custody arrangement he'd fought for years to maintain. One assault charge, even in self-defense, could destroy everything. "You can hit me if you want," Mark said, his voice low and controlled. "But there's a camera right there." He pointed to the security camera mounted above the stairwell. "And my daughter is inside watching. You want to explain to a judge why you assaulted someone in front of a 6-year-old? Richard's eyes flicked to the camera, then to the apartment door. Through the small window beside it, Lily's face was visible, her eyes wide with terror. Something shifted in Richard's expression. The rage didn't disappear, but it retreated behind a mask of cold calculation. "This isn't over," he said quietly. The words meant only for Mark. "She belongs with me, and she knows it." He turned and walked down the stairs, his footsteps echoing long after he disappeared. Mark waited until he heard the car engine start and pull away. Then he unlocked the door with hands that were steadier than they should have been. Inside, Sarah was pressed against the wall, trembling so violently she could barely stand. Lily hadn't moved from the window, her face pale and frozen. Mark went to his daughter first. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around her, feeling her small body shaking against his chest. "Daddy, that man was scary," she whispered. "I know, baby, but he's gone now. I won't let anyone hurt you ever." He held her until the shaking stopped, then carried her to the bedroom and tucked her in with Mr. Hops. She clung to the bunny like a lifeline, her eyes still too wide in her small face. When he returned to the living room, Sarah had slid down the wall to the floor. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I brought this to your door, to your daughter. This is exactly what I was afraid of." Mark sat down beside her on the floor. "How did he find you?" "Phone. He must have tracked it before I thought to turn off the location. I should have known. He always finds me." She buried her face in her hands. "I should leave tonight before he comes back." "And go where?" "I don't know. A shelter, the street, anywhere that's not here. Putting you and Lily in danger." Mark was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and gently pulled her hands away from her face. "You're not going anywhere tonight. We're going to lock the door, and tomorrow I'm going to figure out what our options are. But you don't run scared in the middle of the night." That's what he wants. Sarah stared at him like he was speaking a language she'd forgotten how to understand. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me anymore." "I know enough." He stood and offered her his hand. "Come on, you need sleep." That night, Mark checked the locks 3 times. He wedged a chair under the front door handle. He lay awake on the couch, listening to every sound in the building, waiting for footsteps that never came. The days that followed were heavy with unspoken tension. Mark called in favors he didn't have, reaching out to everyone he knew for any kind of help. A coworker mentioned a lawyer who did pro bono work through a domestic violence shelter. Mark got the number and made an appointment. But at home, things were fracturing. The stress was getting to him in ways he couldn't hide. His shifts felt longer. His patience felt shorter. The bills kept piling up. And now there was the added cost of worrying about security, about safety, about everything he'd been trying so hard to hold together. On the 10th night, Lily spilled her milk across the kitchen table. It soaked through her homework, turning careful pencil marks into gray smudges. "Lily!" Mark's voice came out sharper than he intended, loud enough to make both Lily and Sarah flinch. "Can't you be more careful?" The moment the words left his mouth, he wanted to take them back. Lily's face crumpled. She didn't cry, which was somehow worse. She just went very still, then slid off her chair and walked to her bedroom without a word. The door closed with a soft click that felt louder than any slam. Mark stood there staring at the spreading puddle of milk, hating himself. Sarah silently got a towel and began cleaning it up. She didn't look at him, didn't say anything, and her silence was its own kind of judgment. Later, after the milk was cleaned and the apartment was quiet, Mark crept into Lily's room. She was curled on her side. Mr. Hops clutched against her chest, her eyes closed, but her breathing too uneven for sleep. He sat on the edge of her bed and put his hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, baby," he whispered. "Daddy's just tired. But that's not an excuse. I shouldn't have yelled at you." Lily didn't respond. Maybe she was asleep after all. Or maybe she just didn't have words for what she was feeling. Mark stayed there for a long time, his hand on his daughter's shoulder, wondering when he'd become the kind of father he'd promised himself he'd never be. The next morning, Sarah was quieter than usual. She moved through the apartment like a ghost, avoiding eye contact with Mark. He knew what she was thinking because he was thinking it too. This wasn't working. Something had to give. But he didn't know what, and neither did she. So they said nothing, and let the silence grow. On the 12th day, Mark came home to find Sarah on the phone speaking in hushed tones. She hung up quickly when she saw him. "Who was that?" "A shelter downtown. They have a bed available starting next week." Mark felt something cold settle in his chest. "You're leaving?" "I'm thinking about it." Sarah couldn't meet his eyes. "Mark, look at what's happening. You yelled at Lily. You haven't slept properly in days. You're falling apart, and it's because of me." "It's not because of you." "Then why?" She finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "Why is everything falling apart?" He didn't have an answer. Maybe because everything had been falling apart long before she arrived, and her presence had just made it impossible to ignore anymore. That afternoon, Lily drew another picture. Mark found it on the kitchen table after his daughter had gone to bed. 2 stick figures inside a house, a third figure outside the door. Back turned, walking away. He stared at it for a long time. At 2 a.m, unable to sleep, Mark walked to the bedroom door and pushed it open a crack. Sarah was awake, sitting up against the headboard, staring at nothing. Lily slept beside her, Mr. Hops tucked under her chin. Sarah saw him and put a finger to her lips. She carefully extracted herself from the bed and joined him in the hallway. "I saw Lily's picture," she said quietly. "So did I. She's waiting for me to leave. She's already grieving it." Mark leaned against the wall. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know what I want anymore. I only know what I don't want." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "I don't want to hurt that little girl. I don't want to hurt you. But staying seems to hurt everyone, and leaving seems to hurt everyone, and I don't know how to exist in a world where every choice causes pain." She was crying now, silent tears that she wiped away impatiently. "The shelter called back today," she continued. "They can take me tomorrow if I want. They have resources, legal aid, job placement, everything I need to start over." "Is that what you want? To start over somewhere else?" Sarah closed her eyes. "I want to not be a burden. For once in my life, I want to stand on my own 2 feet without dragging someone else down with me." Mark understood. He hated it. But he understood. She wasn't running away from him. She was running toward something she'd never had, an identity that wasn't defined by the men around her. "If that's what you need," he said slowly, "then you should go." She opened her eyes. Something in them broke. "You're not going to fight for me to stay?" "Is that what you want me to do?" The question hung between them, unanswered and unanswerable. In the morning, Mark left for work before anyone else was awake. He couldn't face it. Couldn't face her. Couldn't face the goodbye that was coming, whether he wanted it or not. When he came home that evening, the apartment was quiet in a way that made his heart stop. Sarah's few belongings were gone. Her shoes weren't by the door. The bathroom no longer held her toothbrush. On the kitchen table, he found a letter. "Mark, thank you for everything. But I can't keep doing this to you and Lily. You opened your door when no one else would. That means everything. But I have to find my own way now. Please tell Lily I'm sorry, and that Mr. Hops helped. So?" Beside the letter on Lily's bed lay the worn, stuffed bunny. Sarah had given it back. Mark stood in the empty apartment, the letter crumpling in his fist. Then he heard a small voice from the hallway. She left. Lily stood in the doorway to her room, her face pale like Mommy. Mark dropped the letter and went to his daughter. He knelt down in front of her, searching for words that wouldn't come. "Daddy," Lily whispered, "why does everyone leave us?" The question broke something open inside him. All the walls he'd built, all the careful distances he'd maintained, all the protection he'd wrapped around his heart to keep from being hurt again. None of it mattered when his daughter looked at him with those eyes. He didn't have an answer. He'd never had an answer. But for the first time, he realized that maybe the answer wasn't about why people left. Maybe it was about fighting for them to stay. Mark stood in the middle of his apartment, his daughter's question echoing in his ears. "Why does everyone leave us?" He looked at Lily, at her small face, that had learned too young to expect disappointment. He looked at the letter crumpled in his hand, at the bunny lying abandoned on the bed, and he made a decision. "Baby, I need you to stay with Mrs. Higgins for a little while." He was already moving toward the door, grabbing his keys from the hook. The leather pendant swung and caught the light. Lily's eyes went wide. "Where are you going?" "To bring her back." He knelt down in front of his daughter. "Or at least to ask her to stay. The rest is up to her." "What if she says no?" Mark touched Lily's cheek gently. "Then at least we tried. At least she'll know we wanted her here." He knocked on Mrs. Higgins's door, explained he had an emergency, and was in his car within 3 minutes. The shelter. He could call them, find out if Sarah had arrived, but something told him she hadn't gone there. Not yet. He thought about what she'd told him during those late-night conversations. Fragments of her past that she'd shared like pieces of broken glass, careful not to cut either of them. Her mother, who died 3 years ago. The lakeshore park where they used to go when Sarah was young. "The water helps wash away the bad thoughts," her mother used to say. Mark drove toward the lake. The park was nearly empty in the fading afternoon light. A few joggers on the path, a man walking his dog, and there on a bench facing the gray, icy water, a woman with a duffel bag at her feet. Mark parked and walked toward her. His footsteps crunched on the frozen gravel path, loud enough that she heard him coming. She didn't turn around. He sat down on the bench beside her. The lake moved slowly past them, steel gray and quiet. "You should be with Lily," Sarah said without looking at him. "Mrs. Higgins is with her. She'll be fine for an hour." Sarah kept her eyes on the water. "How did you know I'd be here?" "You told me about this place, about your mother." She nodded slowly, as if she'd forgotten she'd shared that piece of herself. "I used to come here when I was a kid, whenever things got bad at home, before it got worse, before Richard." She finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were red but dry. "I can't keep being your problem, Mark. You're not my problem." He held her gaze. "You're my choice." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah shook her head. "You don't know what you're choosing. Richard won't stop. He'll keep coming. He'll make your life hell. He'll use Lily against you if he can." "I talked to that lawyer, the one from the shelter." Mark reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card worn at the edges from being handled too many times. "She says we can file for a restraining order. It won't be quick and it won't be easy, but it's a start." Sarah stared at the card like it was written in a language she couldn't read. "You did that?" "I did that for us, all 3 of us. There is no us, Mark. There's you and Lily. And I'm just someone who crashed into your life because I had nowhere else to go." Mark turned on the bench, so he was facing her fully. "You want to know why I still have that pendant? The one from graduation?" Sarah didn't answer. Because it reminds me of the last time I let something good slip away without fighting for it. I was 17 years old and I thought I had all the time in the world. I thought if something was meant to be, it would just happen. He shook his head. I'm not 17 anymore, and I'm done waiting for things to just happen. What are you saying? I'm saying that my apartment is too small, my bank account is too empty, and I've got a little girl who's already had her heart broken once. He reached over and took Sarah's hand. She flinched but didn't pull away. But she drew a picture this morning. You want to know what it was? Sarah shook her head. 2 people in a house, and a third person walking away. Mark squeezed her hand gently. She's already grieving you, Sarah. She's already convinced herself you're gone. And when I asked her why everyone leaves, I didn't have an answer. I've never had an answer. But I'm tired of not having answers. I'm tired of letting people walk away because fighting for them is hard. Sarah's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. If you stay, Mark continued, we'll figure it out together. Not because I feel sorry for you, not because I owe you anything, but because I want you there. Lily wants you there. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can offer each other. What if it's not enough? Her voice was barely a whisper. What if I'm too broken? What if I can't be what you need me to be? I'm not asking you to be anything except yourself. The rest we figure out as we go. Sarah looked back at the lake. The sun was setting now, painting the water gold and orange against the ice. Okay, she said finally. Mark blinked. Okay, I'll stay. She turned to face him, and something in her expression had shifted. Not fixed, not healed, but different, lighter. But I'm paying rent as soon as I get a job, and I'm filing for divorce, and I'm not going to be some damsel you rescued. I'm going to stand on my own feet, even if I have to learn how. Mark felt a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Deal. They sat there for a while longer, watching the sun sink below the horizon. Then Mark stood and offered her his hand. Come on. There's a little girl at home who needs to know you're not leaving. Sarah took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. She picked up her duffel bag and followed him to the car. The drive back was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not heavy with unspoken words, but light with things that didn't need to be said. When they walked through the apartment door, Lily was sitting on the couch with Mrs. Higgins pretending to watch television, but her eyes went straight to Sarah, wide and uncertain. Sarah set down her bag and walked over to the couch. She knelt down so she was at eye level with Lily. I'm sorry I left, she said. That wasn't fair to you. Lily clutched Mr. Hops tighter. Are you going to leave again? I don't want to, but I can't promise that bad things won't happen. I can only promise that I'll try my best to stay. Sarah reached out and gently touched Lily's cheek. Is that okay? Lily considered this with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. Then she held out the bunny. You forgot Mr. Hops. Sarah took the bunny and held it against her chest. Thank you for keeping him safe for me. That night, after Mrs. Higgins had gone home and Lily was asleep, Mark and Sarah sat on the couch in the darkness. The apartment was still too small. The bills were still piled on the table. Nothing had really changed, and yet everything had. Thank you for coming to find me, Sarah said quietly. Thank you for answering the phone that night. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Outside, the city hummed with its endless noise. But inside the apartment, there was peace. 3 weeks later, Lily presented Mark with a new drawing. 3 stick figures inside a house, all of them smiling, and above the door, in careful marker letters, one word: home. Mark looked at his daughter, then at Sarah, who was washing dishes and humming a song he didn't recognize. Ordinary, simple, and perfect because of it. "This is beautiful, baby," he said. Lily nodded with complete confidence. "I know." That night, long after everyone should have been asleep, Mark stood at the window looking out at the city lights reflecting off the snow. Sarah came up beside him. "There's still room, you know," he said softly. "Not just in the apartment." Sarah took his hand and interlaced her fingers with his. "I know," she said. Outside, the city sprawled, endless and indifferent. But in one small apartment on the 3rd floor, a light stayed on. A single point of warmth in the darkness. A family that had chosen each other. A home that had room enough for 3. Moral of the story. Family isn't always defined by blood, but by the courage to open the door when you are afraid, and the commitment to stay when the world gives you every reason to leave. True love is not just a feeling, but the daily choice to be someone's safe harbor in the storm.